Hello there. I am Rabbi Elliot Dorff, and I'm pleased to be in conversation with Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, who is the rabbi of Park Synagogue and in Manhattan. Former student of mine, although he looks much younger than that. And we are going to be talking about synagogue life in the present under the pandemic. And then we're going to be talking about synagogue life in the future and what synagogues will look like in the future after the pandemic is over. So let's begin with right now, including some of the challenges that congregations are having in being congregations when they cannot come together. So let's start with just simply, let's say, a minyan. Elliot, how do you have a minyan under these circumstances?
So, first of all, I'm going to take a prerogative here and just thank you, Rabbi Dorff. You're my teacher. I grew up in Los Angeles. I feel like this is such a sweet moment. I would book a Zoom time with you any day of the week, and the fact that we're doing this like this to reconnect with someone who I can honestly say I would not be doing what I'm doing today if not for you and your mentorship over the years. I also want to just share what a sweet feeling it is to do this under the auspices of AJU, because though I'm now serving a community, Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, I know where my roots are, and I know the institution that gave me wings to fly. And for me, it all began in Southern California at AJU, and so I applaud all of the public programming and the learning. May you and your colleagues go from strength to strength each and every day. And finally, I do want to note that given this is Southern California, I see the participant list, and I'm not going to embarrass any one person other than my parents, who I see that they are watching this moment. So to Malcolm and Gay Cosgrove and all of those in their social circles, I am sure I'll get emails afterwards as to things and I should have said or could have said, but I hope everyone's healthy.
I'm sure you will be fine.
So minyan, I mean, your question is a minyan, but the bigger question, of course, is at a synagogue. It's a beit midrash, it's a beit tefillah, it's a house of learning, it's a house of prayer, and it's all. But fundamentally, it's a beit knesset. It's a house of gathering. And right now, we're in it. I like to use a word, physically distant, not socially distant. I think we can be physically distant and socially connected. And so for this is raised in now dating back to March, how do you assemble in prayer given what's going on? And we very quickly pivoted in our community to a combination of technologies of Zoom and live stream. And we had to make a decision in a pinch. I know you are really at the center of these conversations, Rabbi, about things you can and can't say in a minyan, Kaddish, Baruch Hu, other prayers that require a minyan. I'm very curious to hear, but speaking just for Park Avenue, I knew that we had to make a snap decision there. And so the clergy of Park Avenue Synagogue began to stream our minyan immediately, and that has been the case ever since. And we are also, and maybe we'll get to this, we're also having Shabbat services on Friday night, Shabbos morning, Mincha, Havdalah as a community each and every week. And that's been very powerful, and I'm happy to follow it up with particulars. I do want to remind people also that there is a Q&A bar, so if people want to list questions, throughout for either Elliot, Elliot the wise or Elliot the young, then please just put them in the Q&A box.
Well, let me just say that that within the conservative movement, there's a broad range of responses to this. There are some rabbis who simply are not willing to see a Zoom minyan as a minyan, and so therefore will not do any of the things that require a minyan. There are some who will not do most of the things that require a minyan, but will do mourner's Kaddish, because there is some precedent, believe it or not, there is some precedent back to Seder Rav Amram Gaon in the 8th century, one of the first compendiums about prayer that has Kaddish without a minyan. Now that's a long time ago, and for over 1,000 years we've required it. So if we're going to have Kaddish without a minyan, it is only really for the current situation, which is an emergency situation. So there are those who will not have a minyan for most things except for Kaddish, and then there are those who see Zoom as a way of having a minyan during this emergency situation for all purposes. And then in regard to Shabbat, there are the extra issues there. Do you require that a live stream or a Zoom conference be set up before Shabbat? That people click in before Shabbat in order to be able to participate on Shabbat, or do you see the Zoom link not to be writing on Shabbat? So you have both the electricity issues and the writing issues on Shabbat.
But Rabbi Dor, this is a question that I'd love to ask you, which is this category of Jewish law of Sha'at Hadachak, of unprecedented circumstances that would enable you to do X, Y, or Z that under normal circumstances you would never do.
Right.
So in my lifetime and in your life, I mean, we are living, if there ever was a moment of unprecedented circumstances that Jewish law has to adapt. I mean, this is a calling card. You're the chief intellectual figure of the conservative movement, the chief legal mind, and I'm just wondering, how does the unprecedented nature of our moment inform halachic decision making in this moment?
In multiple ways, and because it is unprecedented, literally by definition, there is no precedent, and so consequently, it's not at all surprising that rabbis are all over the map as to how flexible they're going to be in terms of what we do now with things like Shabbat services and minyan, and by the way, life cycle events. One of the things that came up very early is what happens when a baby boy is born. What do we do with circumcision? So I actually contacted a urologist in Los Angeles who's also a Moel, and a pediatrician I know who's also a Mohelet, and both of them said to me, better that the boy be circumcised in the hospital on the second day or something, and we do all of the rituals later on when we can come together. Because very shortly after the baby is born, if you want to do, and here opinions vary, by the way, in the medical community, but certainly within a month afterward, you would need anesthesia in order to do it. And the urologist said after 2 weeks. So precedent. So preference number one is the baby is circumcised in the hospital, and then we do all the rituals when we are able to later on. Preference number two is you actually do it on the 8th day, but only with the parents and the Moel in the room. And then on a weekday anyway, you can Zoom to everybody else you want in the family, because you don't need a minyan for those rituals. And so that's preference number two. Preference number three is you wait for everything until the pandemic is over. And similarly for rituals with baby girls. But with the circumcision, you have the medical issue as well. What do you do
Well,
with?
it's interesting. First of all, I do want to note that I'm the black sheep of the Cosgrove family. The family business is urology,
I
and
see.
so I do want to say that it's duly noted that the urologists you consulted on this question were neither my father nor my brother, who I'm sure would have done it pro bono for
Well,
you.
actually, I
Um,
contacted Andy Spalt, who's also a Moel. That's the anyway.
um, So
The-
look, it's fascinating because I've dealt with this question. I'm dealing with these practical halachic questions. I don't have your wisdom, but the babies are being born all the time,
right.
and so this question of your response number one is actually what I've seen New York families do, which is there's as you know something called hatafat dam brit,
Right.
where if a grown man who had already been circumcised converted to Judaism would have that as an option to enter the Brit, the covenant. These children being born during a time of quarantine in the hospital itself, and now no one's actually, it's compressed even further. People leave the hospital in Manhattan after a day just to get out of the hospital.
Right.
And so the circumcision is done then, and we'll serve lox and bagels and have the whole thing, please God, in the months ahead when this really rather, modest moment would be present to assign the child a Hebrew name, to welcome the child, with the lox and bagels when it's safe to do so.
Right.
Funerals are same. There's no public assembly, so questions of every cemetery in New York is different. So whether or not how many people you can actually have at graveside to say Kaddish is an active question. I had a fascinating I'm curious how you would have handled it, but to execute a get, the Jewish divorce document. A couple was going through a divorce in my community, and as is the case in the civil divorce proceedings, there was a requirement written in that by such and such date, the couple had to, help facilitate the Jewish divorce document, the get. Problem being that you need to have people in the room
Right.
in order to have that get executed. And that was, I got some counsel from a colleague of ours, Rabbi Azikoff, on how to do it by way of an emissary to have a get written up within the time frame. So these are things,
Right.
grateful as I am to AJU for my rabbinic education, they didn't teach us any of this in rabbinical school.
Well, this is unprecedented, right? So, right. Yes, actually, Rabbi Asikoff was part of the joint Beit Din of the Rabbinical Assembly in the United Synagogue, and I am as well. And that's exactly the procedure that we worked out for the time being. Let me pivot now to the future. First of all, how much of this that has happened in the pandemic do you think is going to carry over to the future?
Look, some people are using the language of disruption. Some people are using the language of acceleration, meaning we're now asking questions, and processes that were already in place are now being forced and accelerated because of, and not all bad, not all bad.
Right.
So I'll give you a couple small examples. We have not obviously been able to have Shiva during this time period. So
Right.
I don't know if you've been party to any, but we are now doing Zoom Shiva.
Right.
And so families, so you send out the email, the bereavement goes out from the synagogue. Instead of saying go to such and such address with such and such hours at Minyan, it says a Zoom link, observe Shiva. The memorial prayer said memories are shared because they aren't shared at graveside because it's only immediate family. And you say, depending on the family and the moment, Kaddish or a memorial prayer at the conclusion of the service. On the one hand, it's terrible because the limitations of the hour prevent us from being in each other's presence. On the other hand, I have to tell you, some incredibly moving moments have happened where you have a high school friend who would otherwise not be present tell a story about their buddy, or you have the distant relative who's in Israel who's able to be present in a way. I can very easily imagine, please God, vaccine and therapy, please God, in the future, a family suffers a loss and says Monday and Tuesday at the home of the Schwartz family, and Wednesday Shiva by Zoom. So that's something, it's small, but I think it's wisdom learned. Our entire learning has been transformed to online, as evidenced by this, which has, same with our services. You know, I believe that there's a power and significance to learning in the company of other people, and there's a tremendous loss that we can't do that. At the same time, people who are otherwise homebound or by way of distance, not able to come into the building, I can imagine my adult ed catalog having a list of classes that are in person and a list of classes that are virtual. My B'nai Mitzvah tutors who are training up our kids to Mapach, Pashta, and how to sing on key or off key, depending on the kid. The feedback I'm getting right now is it's far more effective to teach a kid like this when you have their undivided attention than it is, you know, when they're, you know, so there are different things, the goods and services of a synagogue. I think we're going to ask a lot of these questions about what will be part of our future.
Right, and what does it mean to be a community, right? I mean, let me put it the other way. What do we lose by doing it all on Zoom?
All right, so you'll be able to put this in more sophisticated language than I can, but I believe that I'm not surprisingly, I put my bets on the synagogue, right? Mm-hmm. I believe that a synagogue in a moment of time where of disintermediation, right? There's no more Borders books of blessed memory. I don't know how long the Barnes and Noble, right? We Blockbusters, you know, I tell my children about this thing called Blockbuster Video, and they don't know what it is. You know, and so what place do synagogues have? Period. This is pre-corona. So the thesis of my career is that synagogues, as the most countercultural institution, will always have a place, meaning the human need for you know, social connection, of going through, you know, unlike a lecture society where you drop in, you drop out, or a ball game, that you're actually, you know, the same place where you're celebrating a simcha is a place you're taking an adult ed class, you're serving on a committee meeting, maybe you traveled to Israel with your congregation, you're raising your children together, that there is a value added, a differentiated place of value that synagogues have in communal and identity formation that no other institution has. And you can challenge that, or people on the Q&A can challenge that, but you know, those are my talking points, and I'm sticking to them.
I think you're right. To quote an ancient Jewish source, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. Right? We really do need those kinds of personal interactions, and there's a limit to what you can do on a screen. Right. You can't hug somebody on a screen, right?
Right. So my concern is that at this point, all of the unspoken points of socialization that we don't even know, right? What's the magic of a class? You've taught far more than I have, right? The magic of the class is the quiet conversation you have with the student as she or he is walking out the door, or
Right.
the friendship that you strike up with the person at the desk next to you, and you sort of share a quick word about the content, and it turns into a cup of coffee. My children who go to high school are well able to have do calculus through their Zoom class, but they're not standing outside the building waiting for the bus to come in the same way. And in synagogue speak, right, you may or may not like the Cantor's Musaf, but you're gonna go to Kiddush afterwards and have a quick schmooze with your friends. Those moments are not happening right now. I think that is an unspeakable and unquantifiable loss that we are all suffering from right now.
I agree with you completely. By the way, the same sort of thing for university life and for school life generally, right? Which is because the same question about synagogues is now being raised about universities. If you can get the credit online and never attend a class in person, and ultimately get a degree that way, then why spend the money to to live on campus and all of that? And I think you're right. I think as in synagogues, so too in universities, there are advantages that we're just now beginning to be able to identify in in-person kinds of contacts that we simply cannot do on screen. But it's going to be interesting to see how all of that works out. By the way, I mean, just historically, synagogues were originally just places of worship and maybe a class here or there. And I still remember in 78, 79, I had a sabbatical in Israel, and the synagogues there then, I think still now, are places of worship and maybe a class here or there. It actually was Mordechai Kaplan back in the 30s, 1930s, who came up with the idea of a synagogue center. That is where you would also have social events and social action events and maybe even athletic events. The shul with the pool, as they used to call it, right? And so during the middle of the 20th century, you had a lot of synagogues called the so-and-so synagogue center. But he had the insight, I think, to understand that a synagogue really is a Beit Knesset, a place of assembly in the broadest form that one can think of. And in that way you're absolutely right, in our own day, is really countercultural, where it is very individualistic, everybody with their iPhone, and that's that. And that, by the way, I think is also important in terms of the sociological factors that lead to the future, that affect the future of synagogues. Because people are getting married much later, if they're getting married at all. I mean, in my generation, you got married in your mid-20s, and you had children, and either when you got married or when you had your first child, that's when you joined a synagogue, and that's where synagogue membership came from, right? Now that people are delaying marriage, if they're getting married at all, into their late 30s and 40s, how's that affecting your synagogue?
Look, the issue of late marriage or non-marriage is a sociological observation, not unique to the Jewish community, but as you correctly say, has deep implications on the synagogue model. People are signing up for early childhood much later. The Odyssey years, meaning the years between graduating college and signing up your kid for early childhood, in your day, it sounds like that was about 20 minutes. In my day, it could be 20 years. And so I think we as a synagogue, I mean, this is not a Corona particular conversation, but we understand that we need to engage the children of our congregation, members or not, and their peers during these quote unquote Odyssey years. So Park Avenue Synagogue has a large staff, a robust clergy staff, and so there are hours and hours of our clergy time, not mine personally, because I'm no longer the young cool rabbi, but there are young cool rabbis on my staff whose sole purpose is to do study circles, to go down to neighborhoods in Manhattan, to not, I have the good fortune that I'm not driven strictly on the question of, are they dues paying members? Meaning I can look long a little bit on this, and if someone has, as a 25-year-old young professional living in Manhattan, my leadership gets it that we need to invest a little now, so when that young couple does decide to join the synagogue, whether it's Park Avenue or another synagogue, that they will not be untethered from the institutions of Jewish life. So, and that's also membership models, right? If I see some of the questions coming in, about the membership dues and other things, right? You can't. I think that synagogues need to make their budgets, pay their staff. There's value to synagogue life, right? I think in your Talmud class, there's, what was it? Asya de Magen, Kamagen, Magen Shav. A doctor who charges nothing is not worth anything.
That's right.
A Jewish community that doesn't charge anything is making a statement about its goods and services. At the same time, I think we need to make sure those barriers of entry are altogether surmountable for those seeking Jewish life.
And when I think, again, just historically for a moment, what Kaplan did in the 1930s was really revolutionary. Another kind of revolution was created by Rabbi Harold Schulweis, Alav Shalom, who in the early 1970s realized that the large synagogue was just simply not serving the needs of people who wanted more intimate connections. And so he created all of these chavurot within the synagogue. So you still had the big synagogue, but you also had groups of, in that case, 10 couples or 20 people, 20 singles, who would meet together for social events and reading books together and life cycle events and the like. So you had both the small intimate connections and within the structure of the synagogue, and then also the larger things that a large synagogue can afford to provide. I'm wondering whether now that people are postponing marriage for as long as they are, whether we need a new kind of way of reaching people in their 20s and 30s, whether we need a new kind of, I don't know what that is. I'm 76, next week I'll be 77, so I'm the wrong person to create this. But I'm wondering from a broad historical point of view, whether we need another kind of way, and not really new programs.
Have you ever heard of Tinder?
Pardon me?
You can swipe right, swipe left.
I've heard of these things. I have no ability to use any of them, right?
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I get 200 emails a day. I can barely handle that. Forget about Facebook, Tinder, all of those things. Just not me. Okay. In my next life, maybe.
But I think the point is that if I could redirect very quickly, I think the point is it's not you, and maybe it's not even me, right? Because my kids are all college bound right now. The question is this young adult coming out of college right now, and I do think Hillels on campus should be partners in this. How can the Jewish world pivot? I mean, look, there's a synagogue behind me. You can see it, right? And a lot of these young adults are not going to walk into that big, scary building. And so what, we need to be able to pivot. That maybe that's through technology. Maybe that's through whatever the next generation of chavurot, right? We need to, I imagine that when Rabbi Schulweis, alav shalom, came up with this idea, people probably said, that's a crazy idea. Like, who wants that? Like, what's wrong with just hearing the chazan and the senior rabbi in the main sanctuary, right? But you yourself know, what is the story of Beth Am, if not the story of how fabulous and prominent rabbis figured out a way to work side by side with the library minyan and other small sub-communities. It didn't diminish the Rembaums of the world, right? It actually increased their stature, that they realized that people needed different modalities to connect. I'm not party to that conversation. I don't know the particulars of VBS or of Beth Am, but the really successful congregations are the ones who pivot and have hybrid models.
Right. And it's and I think one of the things that this will do is force synagogues to sort of remember their mission statements, right? I mean, what exactly is the mission of a synagogue? I think part of it is the things that we've been talking about, coming together as a community in a whole variety of different ways and being there for each other in very personal ways and also in very communal ways. But I think part of it is also to try to foster our knowledge of and commitment to Jewish values, to notions like, like what does it mean to be moral in our time? What does what does God mean to us in our time, right? I mean, I know when I was in rabbinical school back in the 1960s, I was ordained in 1970. One of the things that many of my colleagues complained about was that it was the Jewish Theological Seminary, but we never talked about the word about God, except if it happened to be in a text, right? Now, to be honest, I mean, that was also the time of the Civil Rights Movement and of the Six-Day War and all kinds of other things that were going on at the time, right? But certainly in a synagogue, I mean, I think there needs to be conversations about what does God mean in our lives, right? What does Jewish community mean in our lives? What does Israel mean in our lives, right? What are we hoping for in an American society? Those kinds of ultimate things, those kinds of ultimate questions that all of us need to address in one way or another, some of us more than others. But I think part of those kinds of ultimate concerns that Judaism is all about is very much part of a mission of a synagogue. And I think synagogues really need to sort of reconnect to that.
And I don't think that's going anywhere. I think the opposite. I think in these moments of uncertainty, I think the calling cards that prompted you to go to rabbinical school, prompted me to go to rabbinical school, are more pressing than ever. It's hard for me to quantify these things, but I can tell you that during this time of quarantine, I have felt an increased appetite for questions of meaning, of ritual, of access to tradition, of not just because people are sitting at home, but I have this guy in my congregation. We all have this guy, but I actually do have this guy who every time I see him, he reminds me he's not into this religion stuff. It's just that he married the person he did.
Yes.
That's why he sends it, and he said, Rabbi, it's never meant so much to me to observe Shabbat as it does now, because everyone's living on top of the shop. We're all working in circumstances we didn't imagine, and for him to be able to sit at a Shabbos table, he said, I finally get it in a way I never did. We were talking about new parents earlier. You know, I have many stories like this. He had just welcomed his child, and he didn't know the blessing of a Friday night table, and wanted to be able to bless his child because he felt that his soul needed to bring this child in to this world with blessing and tradition. So a million stories I can share. And I also think what you're alluding to in the 60s, and let's not forget what's going on in our nation right now, I think the call for moral leadership, and let me try to say this in a apoliticized way, I think that the role of our synagogues, for lack of a moral voice in the public sphere, there's a vacuum out there. I think there's an increased thirst and responsibility of synagogues and rabbinic leadership to speak with authenticity in the name of tradition to the issues of the day that has never been more urgent.
Right. And I think both in terms of public issues, public morality issues, and private issues. Now, especially because, you know, a lot of businesses on the internet. So what does copyright mean now, right? Is it fair? Is it not only legal, but is it moral to copy things that are copyrighted? Those kinds of questions in business ethics. Now, especially because of the internet, major questions about modesty in language and harmful language. The ethics of language has really begun to explode, because what used to be a private conversation between two people is now viral within seconds. And so if your comment was somewhat nasty, and it could have been lost within seconds a generation ago, now 1,000 people have it, right?
It's instant and forever.
Right. And, it's that old Hasidic story about, the pillow, and you open the pillow and the feathers go all over the place, right? And you can't get them back again. So what does that mean in terms of how we talk to each other and how we talk about each other? I mean, all of these kinds of things, it seems to me, are critical issues in our time that Judaism definitely addresses. One of the great things I think about Judaism is that it doesn't just give you general moral principles. It does do that. Love your neighbor as yourself. Justice shall you pursue. Those kinds of things, right? Love the stranger. It does give you those kinds of general rules, but it also makes it very specific, right? What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? What does it mean to honor your parents? Is that just a matter of attitude, or is that really something that you need to do? And how do you go about expressing that? So I think one of the great things about the Jewish tradition is that it is a legal tradition that is able to specify a lot of the details about those moral parts of our lives. That doesn't mean that everybody's terrible. On the other hand, we are human beings, and we make mistakes, and we don't do things right all the time. And another thing that Jewish tradition gives us is a way of making amends when we are not able, when we do something wrong, right? So, I mean, all of those things, I think, are critical parts of the tradition that we have inherited that make it meaningful for our lives. And that I think is really central to a synagogue's mission, to try to educate people to that, to have forums about that, to help people overcome their insecurities and their moral questions. And another piece of it, I have to say, I was very much influenced by Camp Ramah. And one of the things that was very influential to me there was the simple joy of being Jewish. The songs we sang at many meals. We danced, we put on plays in Hebrew, all right? We played basketball in Hebrew, right? The simple joy of the tradition, I think, is also something that you really cannot connect to online. And so part of, I think, what synagogues are going to be about in the future is recapturing a lot of these communal ties that just simply are pale by comparison when they're done online. At least that's my view. We have some questions about simply the economics of synagogues. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Give to your synagogue, whichever
Yeah.
synagogue it is. So look, there are far more unknowns than there are knowns. Synagogues rely on membership. If there's a school, then synagogues rely on tuitions, and synagogues rely on the philanthropic giving of their membership. I mean, the percentages of the pie might be different synagogue to synagogue, but that's the basic math. And the vast majority going towards the salaries of your synagogue employees and programs and keeping the lights on. So I think the economic uncertainty will have significant impacts on the viability of the synagogue model because people will be making choices. I see one of the questions about, am I going to spend whatever my synagogue dues are, all the more so if I can get it online, all the more so if if my synagogue is not having services on the high holidays, right? So just to speak openly about it,
Right.
the algorithm of the high holidays is to fit as many tuchuses in as few of seats as possible. And that's sort of the gatekeeping moment of synagogue membership. You don't need a ticket to walk into a synagogue on 362 other days of the year. I think I'd like to think that me and my colleagues work tirelessly to make sure the goods and services of Jewish life are accessible, independent of financial need. But you and I, Rabbi, both know those needs are going to grow exponentially this fall.
Right.
And so I think that there are real questions. And I think, the question, and there were questions before, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what you're alluding to, whether that Kaplan model of membership to a synagogue center was a viable model. And I think that this moment is going to be, and here it's not for good, meaning to the benefit of all. I think it's going to accelerate some questions for synagogues that were struggling to begin with. And now all of a sudden their long-term viability and shifting demographics are just going to force very uncomfortable questions. I would like to think the optimist in me would connect this part of the conversation with the 10 minutes ago when we were talking about new modalities of Jewish engagement, that perhaps there's an opportunity here to recognize, that, maybe, what's happening with AJU right now.
Right.
You are creating content, high quality, me accepted. So I got in on the Elliot Dorff, nepotism rule, right? But it's extraordinary what you guys are doing, right? I mean, my hat's as a professional on the other side, but this could be amazing. Like if there's high quality content being provided on like Spotify or something to, a modest synagogue somewhere that can't get Elliot Dorff to be a scholar in residence, but maybe can get, there are people a lot smarter, well, not smarter than you, but who are more adept,
yes, there are. Yes.
more adept at asking these questions about what the next model would be. And I think one of the things that I myself, as sort of this in-between generation, has to ask is not to be entrenched in the models of the past, right? What was the value added of Kaplan? Kaplan recognized that the old world Stiebel model was not going to sell to an American Jewry who were acclimating to the Protestant models of American Jewish life. And to his great credit, he created a revolution in how Jewish communities assembled. We look back on Kaplan as a hero. So my question, and I know we're running out of time, is are we going to have that same courage of spirit right now to respect where we were, but to also say the past is not determinative of the future?
Right.
Can we integrate the old and the new, and can we embrace it and celebrate it, affirm the fears of those who have been raised on the old model, but also know that our goal is to pass down our tradition effectively to the next generation,
Right.
as Kaplan did, period.
And we have that goal, not just because we're Jewish, not just because it's ours, but we have that goal because we find it deeply meaningful, because it speaks to the questions of our lives, the ultimate questions of our lives, both moral and social, and because it speaks to who we are as human beings, as Jews, who we are, what God is, what God means in our lives, what time means in our lives. All of those kinds of ultimate things are what the Jewish tradition is about. And it is about community and about joy and about the ability to help people in mourning as well as in joyful events. All of those things are critical to what it means to be both a human being and a Jew. So I think that piece of the fact that that's our mission statement means that I would hope at any rate that there's a lot of very, very vibrant future, both to the Jewish community and to its synagogues and, by the way, universities. Thank you, Elliot. It's been just such a pleasure.
It's such an honor to share the Zoom screen with you. A big shout out to Southern California. I miss Southern California. And it's just as noble to serve Jews in warm weather as it is in cold weather.
Okay.
So, and hi to my mother and father.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Be well.